Thank you for coming. You could be home watching raindrops coming down on your roof, and you're here, so thank you for coming. I appreciate that very much. As you know, I am an educator by trade. I'm not a historian, but what happened about 5 years ago, just one sentence about me, I played golf at the Brewster Captain's Golf Course. And if you ever played there are two golf courses, each hole named after a captain. You had Captain Parker, Captain Jones, Captain Cook, Captain different names. So I went to the pro about 7, 8 years ago, and said, "Where's the book?" He said, "What book?" He said, "No book." I said, "Well, who are these people? What did they do? What did they accomplish?" I don't know. So that got me going into history. And I can't stop now. I'm reading a lot of history every day, and I got into it. So it's a little bit about my background to let you know. So this book that I wrote is called Slavery and Abolitionism on Cape Cod. And the subtitle is that Massachusetts Incongruity. And the reason I call it that, because from 1620, the Mayflower Day, right through the middle of the 1700s and even beyond, pretty much New England was the head of slave trading. Any black slave that came in through Boston or Cape Cod, pretty much directly. After that, we became the abolitionists. From 1800 to right to the Civil War, pretty much, we became the anti-slavery group. Not entirely, but mostly. It was very fervent anti-slavery. So we're going to learn a little bit about that. Okay, thank you again for coming. I appreciate it. The book you see here, this is a copy of the book. I found a very old book. I couldn't actually take it out, but I could get a look at it. It was written in 1832. It was called Are We All American Citizens? It was a book, with an anti-slavery book, and it showed all the horrible ways, the brutal ways slaves were treated. Because the intent of the book was for people who are either thinking about slavery or want to be slavery. Why are they doing this? It makes no sense to them. So this was a book written in the 1830s, so you can tell. So the first couple of slides I'm going to show you just with Falmouth people, just all Falmouth, just to give you a sense of what Falmouth was involved with. So one of the founders of Falmouth is a fellow named Jonathan Hatch. He came here in the early 1600s, 1660. He was a friend of the Indians. That's on his grave, on his tombstone. He was a friend of the Indians. Unfortunately, you could judge that either way, because one of the things he did quite frequently was gave the indigenous people a lot of alcohol and guns. And then they would, right after giving them alcohol, say, "Well, let's make a deal about your land." So that's not a good combination. So you could look at him either way, but he was helpful. At a time when the indigenous people were not treated well, he learned their language, he integrated with them, and became friendly. So again, it's a matter of that interpretation, how well you got to look at that. He wrote the Bible in the Wampanoag language. He did quite a few things which were helpful to the Wampanoag people. His son, Moses Hatch, acquired indigenous slaves later. He had a couple of families, more than one family he had. One thing I showed, those are Wampanoags, by the way. I couldn't find a Wampanoag family that was a typical Wampanoag. This is a Cherokee family. You get the idea anyway. You can tell by the hair it was Cherokee. But anyway, if you look at the racial composition, back then, if you were indigenous, you didn't have much of a choice. You could either marry another indigenous man or a black man. Those are the only two choices. So as a result, many of the families were racially mixed. So you see that all the time. Indigenous, it was very, very common to have a mixed racial family. And then the Quakers came along. One of the founders of the Quakers is there. One of the things the Quaker did, the founder of the Quakers, George Fox, is right there. That's his picture, that's the founder. Quakers were the first and the only religious group that actually condemned slavery entirely. So they didn't want slavery. In fact, I found a fellow from this town, from Falmouth, Benjamin Gifford, who had a slave, fortuitous slayer, sharper, excuse me, and you can buy the Quakers actually bought the slave from him. Why? Because he wanted to be free. So they wanted to free him, so they paid him money, and that freed him. There was a Falmouth man who relinquished his money for that purpose. When he saved them, this was a 35-year-old man. This guy wasn't a young man. He said, "I'm so happy for my boy." So it kind of struck me a little dismissive, but that's just the way he worded things. That's just the way they spoke back then. Well, by the way, one of the things we did not have back in the early days was a jail. Jails were very, very few and far between. There were a few places where they would put people, but they really weren't jails. If you ever go to the old jailhouse in Barnstable County, you know where the courthouse is? There's a really old jail there. It looks like a cavern. Doesn't look too different than that. It looks like a real top thing. Because they didn't put you in jail. They didn't want jails. They didn't have a lot of people to work the jails. They didn't have money for jails. This was the beginning of our country, before our country even, and there was nothing there. There was nothing to work with. So if you got in trouble, most of the time, they punish you by putting you into labor and in slavery. That's the way they treated you. Sometimes even the white people were put into slavery, depending on what the crime was and how they did it. There was no slavery at all. So I found some examples of what the consequences were. If you killed a sheep without permission, 7 years of slavery. That was what the typical thing was. If you stole money, 25 pounds of money, you would be perpetual slavery. They didn't fool around with that. If you stole a wooden chest or a piece of furniture, that was 18 years of bondage. One man from Mashpee didn't want to go to jail, so he just said, take my 2 children. He had a 5-year-old and a 19-year-old, says, take my 2 kids. So they were allowed to do that back in the day. So it seems crazy, but that was unfortunate, but that's the way they did it. Now, in 1747, I'm pretty sure, they had a study. The Quakers wanted to do a study in the Falmouth, because the Falmouth people kept saying, oh, we help the indigenous people. We gave them jobs. We work with them. We give them labor. We're supportive of them. And they were, but the Quakers wanted to check that out. So they did an interview of all the people in the Falmouth area, and they found that every single indigenous person had a master. They didn't tell you that. And they were restricted in what they can do and what they had, how they did it. So even though they called them free people, they really weren't free indigenous people. They were slaves. So again, depending on your interpretation of that. Yeah, so in 1757, there were 10 indigenous slaves in town, and 6 of them were black. And that's probably typical of a number. If you look at the numbers, I wouldn't say it was a big slavery thing throughout the Cape Cod, the number they found, but I would say maybe 2% of the total population. It's probably the highest point, maybe 2.5%. But after that, it diminished a little bit. So I'll explain those numbers a little later on. Yeah, we're still in Falmouth now. So you know Palmer Avenue. We're kind of right off Palmer Avenue right here. The very first church leader was a fellow named Samuel Palmer, and he had a slave. He had Titus, who was his slave. And Titus he looked to groom the land. He did a lot of heavy lifting. He cleared the land, chopped the trees down, built buildings, and did all the heavy labor. His assistant, his deacon, Benjamin Parker, he had slaves too. He had Cuffy. Every time you see the name Cuffy, I'm going to tell you, they were a very famous family, became Cuffy. I'm going to tell you about them. It's probably the Ashanti family. They probably come from a town in Africa, of Ghana. And they were very skilled workers. And they're very much in demand here in Cape Cod. You'll learn more about them as I spoke to you a little later. Another Falmouth person was the Ray family. It was a woman whose name was Annis B. Ray. And she was an interesting woman. In 1840, she got a group of women together, and they petitioned Washington, D.C. was about to vote, should they be free or slave. They could go either way. They could vote which way they wanted to become. So she petitioned them. There were 3 black women. She was one of them. Maybe we think she might be the main perpetrator of the action to get this thing going. But 3 black women, 70 white people, local women, signed this petition saying, let's make these people free. So that's basically what they did. There was a son. We're going to learn more about him in a minute. Charles B. Ray was born here in Falmouth, and then went to eventually to Connecticut, went to a university, studied ministry, studied religion, and became one of the biggest church congregate pastors in New York City. Very, very popular man. He was definitely known as a slave saver. So he did a lot of Underground Railroad work. After he left here, he did a lot of helping black people escape from slavery. He began a magazine called The Colored American, which was, for a couple of years, was a very popular newspaper. So if you were anti-slave, you'd buy this paper, you'd learn about what's happening that year for those people, and that's, you follow that through. I heard, I don't know how true this is, one author said he managed to save at least 1 slave every day. So I don't know if that's true, but if he did, that's quite a few. His daughter, by the way, became a lawyer, And the good part is she became a lawyer. The bad part was after she got a law degree, she couldn't get a client. No client would work with a black woman, just wouldn't. So then she had to try to do other activities. Just couldn't do it. And I just want to show you this too. This is my book cover. The reason I picked that particular cover, there was a fellow from Falmouth whose name was, or Dennis rather, his name was Sears Crowell. And Sears Crowell began an unusual thing. He began as a sea captain. In fact, he was one of the main, we would bring cotton, not slaves, but cotton from the plantation up to the north, to the textiles, to the mills and so on. He would do that. And he made a great deal of money by doing that. He finally said, no, that's wrong. I can't keep doing this. I feel intuitively it's wrong for me to be doing, helping a slave thing too much. So eventually he began like a little collection booth. Some people looking around the room, maybe my age, maybe, some of them. I remember when I was a kid, remember the March of Dimes? We had a little box. And I remember putting in coins and nickels and pennies and whatever, okay? And you took your box, and then you bring it to somebody. Somebody in town would be the delegate. So you collect that money, and you give it to them. That picture that was on my book was used as a box cover. So a little tiny box, and that's what they used for the anti-slavery. All right, so I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit more about in Boston. This is more Boston people, but I think you need to see the whole picture. Because one of the reasons I wrote this book, I thought about this book, I'm saying, how can people just wake up and say, we're going to take slaves from Africa, bring them here, keep them chained, and keep them, working all the time. How can we do that? And then it just didn't seem right to me. So I did at different levels, I did some research. So at the very beginning, Boston had a guy named Sam Maverick. And that's how we get to the name Maverick today. He's a Maverick, something that's very individualistic and rough and colorful and does unusual things. That's where you got that from him. So I'll talk about each one. So he has Maverick. He had a boat. He came over from England. He was a British man. He was given almost half of Chelsea. A lot of Chelsea was today's Chelsea in Boston, and he became very, very affluent. He began a ferry that went from Chelsea to Boston. So I was reading about a book. If you want to read another good book, other than mine, mine's pretty good, but another one is Wendy Warren wrote Up to New England, was the name of the book. And she talks in her book about this guy Jocelyn, who was a passenger on the boat, all of a sudden heard a terrible scream and went out to look, and there was a woman there. And she was yelling and crying and screaming and said, what's going on, what's going on? So finally Maverick came out, the owner, and said, oh, don't worry about it. I told my male slave to attack her, to rape her, because I want children. Because chattel slavery was how they got money. So it was not uncommon for them to condone rape and what a horrible things. But this is way in the beginning. Dudley was one of our second governors, a very early governor from Massachusetts. So he's saying, how long have we been doing slavery? Right from the very beginning. The very beginning of our Bay State colony, before we became a state, we were heavily engaged in slavery. Dudley, who was our second governor, allowed many people to hold slaves. He didn't do it himself, but his children did, his grandchildren did, so it was not unusual. You remember, this used to be Dudley Square in Boston, then they changed their name to Nubian Square, because many of the black families who lived right in that general area. Another guy too, an early one, is John Usher. So if you look at Somerville, where Somerville is today, the little slice of land right across the river there, Usher was the treasurer for the Dominion of New England. And what he was told to do is help the Queen get as much money as possible. So he kept doing some research and says, well, slavery is pretty effective. We can make a lot of money by doing slavery. So he brought slaves over. He built a farm called 10 Farms, where the first governor, the second governor, the third governor all lived. It was all built by slave labor. They all were definitely slavery people involved with that. He didn't become a very popular man, by the way. In 1689, as a tax collector, with charging a lot of extra money, which didn't need to do it, eventually the citizens kind of rebelled, and they physically chased him to New Hampshire. He couldn't stay in Boston too long, but he was there for a while. Another one from Boston, Charles Apstrop. He was considered the richest man in Boston for a good period of time, maybe 10 years or more. He was a member of the church, the King's Chapel. If you've been to Boston, you know where the Filey's basement is. Not too far, there's a little church there, not little, it's a big church called the King's Chapel. And if you go there, at that time, the congregation had 55 people who had 219 slaves. So there were more than 55 together, but of the total population of the church, 55 of them had over 200 slaves. So you can see it was popular. You can see that slavery was not, a little thing. It was kind of a big thing, especially in the very beginning of our country, or of our colony, actually. Another person at Faneuil Hall. We haven't changed that name yet. We've been talking about it for 10 years. There's a commission that was established to change the name Faneuil Hall because he was definitely involved with slavery. So, in fact, when his uncle died, left him a great deal of money, he built that beautiful building, the Faneuil Hall building, which again is an incongruity because at the very beginning of our colony, they had slave markets, either in the building or in front of the building. So if you want to buy a slave, you go to Faneuil Hall, pick out your slave, and go home, and that's the way you did it back then. But afterwards, after 1800, it was a gift to the colonies. Then they became more anti-slavery, and they had meetings, lots of meetings. All of our abolitionists and so on met there in that building. So I call that an incongruity of this, based on that fact alone. Yeah, I'd say most of our slavery, people think about black slavery being the only type. That's not true. In the beginning of our country, till about almost close to the Revolutionary War period, most of our slaves, the majority, were indigenous people. So when they made slaves, they would talk about a just war. If you have a war and you take people, sounds familiar? If you have the war, you can just take what you want. Sounds familiar today. Anyway, what they basically said, depending on, for example, Pequot War, the King Philip's War, both, some of the soldiers were not paid in money, but they're paid in slaves. So if I'm a lieutenant and I was a good and valiant service soldier and I did what I was supposed to do, at the end of the war I'd be maybe giving a little money, but I would maybe give them 2 slaves. So that's how they paid people sometimes. And they kept the slaves, not forever, that was another difference. Most of the indigenous slaves, like between 5 to 10 years, I would say, wasn't forever, wasn't perpetual. But they didn't, and they no chattel either. If your children were born as an indigenous slave, they were free. They weren't put in slavery. They were definitely free, for the most part. I read too that in one particular year, 1678, the indigenous people attacked homes in Sandwich, Falmouth, and Mashpee. So people got to be very frightened by indigenous people. They thought that, well, at any time, these indigenous people could attack us. And so it was a little different feeling. Believe it or not, they felt safer with black slaves because they didn't know the language, didn't know the country. They came over, they didn't know how to farm or how to survive. Where the local people, they had friends, they had relatives, they had sister tribes, they had people they knew. So they're saying, this is, they kind of figured it out. They kind of came to the realization that maybe it's safer to do black slaves. So that changed right around 1780-ish. The numbers of slaves became less indigenous and much more to the black. That kind of changed. So look at Truro. Truro, again, another minister. This the very first minister there, 1711, was a fellow by the name of John Payne. And when he came here from England, he had 2 slaves with him. One was a very young girl, and one was a big, stocky man. So just the way he did that. That's just the way they did it back then. He was hired. So when you think about it, if I'm coming over from England and I have slaves automatically, what does that mean for me as an American citizen, if I had a Bay State citizen? If I'm here saying, Jesus, the pastor can do it. So the mindset is definitely pro-slavery. There's no question that they had, gave them the moral right, so to speak, to have slavery. This is like a common picture. I couldn't find a real good picture, but this is a woman from Boston, an affluent woman, in 1840, I believe it was. They were just proud. If you had money, I'd say the top 1 or 2% of the people had slaves. You had wherewithal to buy slaves, you probably would do it if you could. So a lot of them would do that, and they're just proud of it. So she was a socialite, and she had a young lady who was her slave, her domestic slave, and they just kind of walked around town and showed people that they had a slave. It's kind of the thing to do, basically. They also had indentured servants. We'll talk about them in a minute, too. They're somewhat different, too, obviously. So in Bourne alone, in the Bourne area, one time there was a particular home. Fellow's name was Zachariah Allen. His home, that's not his home, I couldn't find a particular his home, I couldn't find, but that's a home that would have been typical for that time period, was in Bourne. And he was raided by 3 indigenous people. They came into his house, they stole his property, they did different things, and they were apprehended, they were caught. So the judge found them, and remember I told you the jails. They didn't want jails. They didn't want people in jail. They wouldn't go to do it. So they said to the man, saying, well, for payment, you can have these 3 slaves forever in perpetuity as to be your slaves. Now, I don't know about you, but if people break into my house and then the judge said, you have to take these people as slaves, I wouldn't be too happy. I don't think it would be common sense for me to take those people. But they did. Somehow it worked out. Somehow he kept them and used them in different ways. He might have sold them down the road. There's a farm, too. You're probably familiar with that, the Wingscorton Farm. It's on 6A, not far from Barnstable, between Barnstable and Mashpee, actually. And it was both ways. In the beginning part of our country, that was a farm where the native people would be held. They were held there. They kept them as slaves. And later on, it became like a runaway slave place. And the owner would allow them to be slaves, to be anti-slave. So you can see how the country is kind of changing over periods of time. That picture, by the way, is Squanto. You all know who Squanto is? We're going to talk about him in a minute, too. King Philip is another interest. He was one of the indigenous chiefs. He was the head sachem. He was actually, most of his war was in probably the Natick, Framingham, in the Connecticut area, not so much down here, most in that area. But again, they lost a number of slaves. They lost, I don't know what the exact number was, but I think 8,000 to 9,000 slaves or something. They lost the wars, and they all became indentured serfs. That picture, by the way, was Paul Revere made that. So he was a pretty good artist. He could be the silversmith, but he could do a representation of what the guy looked like, what King Philip looked like, the King Philip War. Underground Railroad, yeah, they definitely had the Underground Railroad. That's been around for a while now. Right here in Sandwich, or right nearby in Sandwich, we know that for sure there were 2. There were probably more than that. We think 4 or 5, but documented 2 for sure. The house of Isaac Davis has a long underground passageway that was used to hide slaves when he was here. Then the First Baptist Church in Sandwich too was also used for that as well. So it definitely was an underground railroad here, and we kept people and protected them and hid them in different ways. By the way, that's kind of a misnomer. When we say the Underground Railroad, from what I can read, and I read a whole bunch of books about slavery, they didn't come through the ground. It was not underground at all. It was by sea. They would go from Georgia, Florida to Boston or Cape Cod, and then maybe a little bit under the ground, underground, so to speak, on the ground point. But they were mostly a maritime situation. It was much safer, much quicker, much easier, so that's basically how people came. We had a guy right here in Barnstable, Shabail Smith, who had a slave, and he beat him so drastically, so dramatically, that he killed him. He died. So he kept whipping and whipping and whipping. The poor guy just died automatically. Was he sent to jail? Nope. The judge heard the case. He did say, however, for the future, he says, if anyone does this in the future, the punishment will be even more harsh. But for you had to pay a fine, a fairly big fine. That was his punishment for killing somebody. But there was a warning, so maybe it was a big beginning anyway. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about religious views. So we talked about political views and other things. We're going to talk a little bit about religious views. I wanted to see where most religions stood on slavery, and it was interesting what I found out. So the very beginning, before we had the Mayflower, we had the Virginia colony. So they began there 4 or 5 years before we did, 1610, I think the Virginia colony began. So they had a group of laws. John Smith was the first Englishman that came over. He had slaves. Most of them are indigenous people. He was the first man to use the term. Those people from up north, they're the New England people. He was the first one to use the term New England, and he was from the South. The Puritans felt, by the way, was their duty, not just arbitrarily, but if you're uncivilized, if you're a savage, you're wrong. We have to teach you our ways. We have to teach you how to become civilized and normal like we are. So that was just their premise. The way they thought about it was they're helping them. They didn't see this as a negative. If anything, they thought that keeping these people enslaved was a benefit to them, which again, in our days today, we don't quite interpret it that way. Congregationalists, that was a very mixed bag. Most of the early congregational churches did not really want to have slavery. And that was because most of the churches in New England were run by sea captains. Why wouldn't sea captains want to end slavery? Any thoughts? Any ideas? It's all about the money. They always follow the money, right? So most of them could make money. And not only could they make money either directly, if you were a slaver, what they call them slavers, if you brought people over, you made money. But think about the coincidental or incidental programs. If you brought rum from Boston to Africa and then eventually to the West Indies, they brought slaves in and brought them to the West Indies. If you were involved with sugarcane, same thing. If you were involved with molasses, same thing. If you're involved with ship, there's a couple of people who did farm. Alewife is not a particularly great fish to eat, so they shipped the alewife to the plantations. So even if they were not direct slavers, they made money. So a lot of the sea captains wanted to keep it going. So they would always say, yeah, we'll end slavery next year. No, we'll end it next week. We'll end it tomorrow. We'll do it. They kept saying it, but they really didn't mean it. They were hoping not to do it. The Jewish people, that was a little different. The Jewish people, there's very few Jewish people, by the way, in the colonies. Less than 1% of our population was Jewish back then. There are a few, but they have a different belief. If you read the Bible, if you owe people money, it was okay to keep a slave. But they were kind of treated more like a family. They could eat at the table with the family, and they were treated quite differently. It wasn't a harsh type thing for those folks. A Catholic view is quite different. Catholic view, let's talk about Columbus for a minute. He was not the nicest man of all time. He was kind of cruel in what he did. I remember when I was a young man in high school, my high school, I went to a Catholic high school, they said, why don't you march on the Columbus Day? So I really didn't want to, I'm not Italian, but anyway, so sure I marched. But I remember marching. And at that time, I'm saying, well, Columbus is kind of a cool guy. He discovered America and he did all these great things. Only to find out later, and you read about him, he had in his contract that any 10% of anything in the colonies was a residual to him. So he wanted money. It was all about the money. He wanted slavery to continue, and we eventually found out more and more about Columbus, and all of a sudden now it's Indigenous People Day. So more and more people don't want to call it Columbus Day because of his horrific actions. He went back to Spain, and Isabella gave the king and queen a couple of slaves. They didn't want them. They said, that's not what we want. But he said, no, that's how you make the money. He wanted the money. So, so we could see that. But he did not treat Indigenous people or slaves very well at all. He was very, very harsh. But again, the papal bull was that the doctrine of discovery, which meant that if you come to North America, Mexico, Canada, anywhere in there, and you're doing things to Christianize people, perfectly okay. You could subjugate them, you could take them hostage, you can treat them poorly, you can do any number of things with them. That's just the way he thought that you could do it. So we changed. It's funny how, again, history changes over time. So I remember like, in my lifetime, Columbus was kind of the cool guy. Now, not so much now. Quakers, this is the one group that kind of fought slavery the most. We mentioned already George Fox and how they bought slaves and they tried to free slaves. And it was true. For the most part, they did. I was reading about a fellow named Benjamin Lundy. In 1670-ish, there was a meeting of Quakers, a national convention, and he was very anti-slavery. He gave a big, long talk and said, you should never have slavery, it's immoral, it's wrong to do it. Meanwhile, he came into the meeting with a pig blood under his coat and kind of hid it, and said, if anyone continues with slavery, I will kill myself. He took out a sword, pierced it right through his jacket, didn't hurt himself, but gave the illusion of dying. So people were fainting and all of that. Did the convention change and vote? Nope, didn't change their mind. They still didn't condemn slavery. The Quakers didn't do it then. They did later. The other two people I want to talk about are the two Brown brothers, Moses and John Brown. They were both Quakers, but two brothers, and one founded Brown University. There's a picture of Brown University right there. And they were initially, both of them were pro-slavery. And then eventually Moses got the idea, I'm not crazy about this. He really wanted to change. He wanted to change the system. John Brown wanted to keep it, however. So in 1770, the Quakers finally did change. I'll tell you what basically preempted that too. We'll get to that in a minute. All right, so let's go back to Squanto a little bit. Squanto, if you remember, 1670, early 1600s, way before the early 1600s, was a fellow by the name of Captain Hunt, who would go along the north coast North America and so on, and captured just native people randomly. He would take a boy here, a girl here, just take people randomly and bring them back to England. One of the people he captured was a young man named Squanto. His Indian name was Testaquen, that was his name, his Wampanoag name. But he went to England for a while, then he went to Spain for a while. And lucky for him, some Spanish monks came across this man, taught him language, gave him a pretty good education, and freed him. They brought him back to America. One of their boats came back to America, and he was free. So when the Mayflower landed in 1620, he knew the language, he knew their language a little bit. He helped it, appear in Thanksgiving myth that we ate together, we had a great old time. Not entirely true, but you can see how that came to be a little bit. All right, so two of the really big indigenous wars, the Pequot War, it was in 1636. About 700 different indigenous people were taken as captives, and they were forced into slavery. So they could, just trade them, use them as monetary value. You could do something with your slaves back then. King Philip's War was a little bigger in scope. King Philip's War was much bigger. It's actually even beyond New York State and beyond a little bit. But I guess the Iroquois, the same native group that we have, the Wampanoags are part of the Iroquois nation. And they just protected them. As you can see, but that's where people began to think about how dangerous this is to have native slaves. They thought that, if we have native slaves, we're not safe. We have to kind of move people around and do things with them that are probably not the best thing altogether. All right, let's talk a little bit about voluntary and involuntary servitude. So that's another form of slavery. And people think it's very benign. It is to a degree, but even there were some issues. So let me tell you about some of the issues. So if you are a young man, young woman, let's just say you're 19, 20 years old, living in England, Scotland, Germany, for the most part, and you want to come to America because there's no opportunity for you in your homeland, you could do that. There are two ways to do it. One way, you could just come over here by yourself, go on the boat, tell the sea captain who's coming over here from England, saying, can I get on your boat? You say, yeah. And what happened then, they would come on the boat, and then when they got here, they would auction them off, just like slaves. They say, there's a cook, and she's a domestic, and she's great for cleaning, and she's great for laundry work, whatever it might be, whatever kind of skill they had. This guy can caulk boats or whatever. They could do different things. So when they got to the port, people would say, he could do that? I'll pay X amount of dollars for that. So in a way, it was more than just involuntary. But the other way of doing it too, they sometimes had pre-arranged meetings, something like a year ahead of time. They could contact someone in America and had an agreement. If you worked for this family for 5 years, you could be their cook or whatever, their culinary expert, and then you get freedom after that. So it seemed a little fair way to me, other than just arbitrarily just kind of took people into it. But it was interesting. I did it both ways. One of the things I found which is interesting too, that to show you the degree, black slaves had a higher value, monetary value, than indigenous indentured servants. I read there's one group of black slaves in Connecticut, they could afford, with a little bit of money they had, to buy indigenous slaves. So that kind of shows you the pecking order of slavery. They can afford to do this if they wanted to. But not many, there was a few though. Now, involuntary servitude, I didn't even know about this either. There were prisons in England, primarily England, a little bit in Scotland too, that had prisoners. There were schools that had young children. There were hospitals that had really just people who were disabled and not doing too good. So sometimes they would advert in the paper. I think I have a picture of one, a picture of the advertisement anyway. They would let sometimes 50 or 100 people from a prison go to America, go to whatever. It couldn't have to be America. It could be England, could be some other place, and build buildings or do things, do construction. They didn't have a choice. They didn't go to them and say, do you want to go to America? No, it was involuntary. They said, you're going to America, and you're going to help them do whatever it is they want you to do. So I didn't think that was particularly fair. This fellow named William Pynchon, he was a British guy, in the very beginning, founded Roxbury, founded Springfield. He did this a lot. He founded a lot of the big buildings in Springfield by getting indigenous people over and working on their farm all together. Remember I said banned in Boston? One of the things he did, he wrote a book called The Meritorious Price of Redemption, which was an anti-Puritan book. It kind of knocked the Puritans, the religion. So the Puritans said that book has to be banned. So his book was the very first book ever to be banned in Boston, banned everywhere. They just said, no, we can't allow a disagreement among us. Another fellow, this is a British guy too, John Hawkins, was a British slaver, was a slave trader. He would take slaves randomly from any African post. The way the British did it, they didn't do it randomly. They sometimes had posts in Africa, 3 or 4 major posts in Africa, where people would kind of assemble the slaves. So they would usually, as a sea captain went over, and there's no slaves to be had a lot. But if you kind of built up over the months, 3 or 4 months to acquire slaves, you'd have a better luck of getting more people. So that's basically what happened with him. The queen liked what he did so much, he made him royal. She knighted him. So you can see his coat of arms. And these coat of arms, by the way, have to be approved by the royal people. So within his coat of arms, you see, right up on top, a black slave. Perfectly okay to have that in your family lineage. We're a black slave person. I'm proud of it. So the queen had no problem in seeing that at all. Let's talk about the colonial servants who were there, the black slaves. In general, mostly, almost, even the indentured servants are kind of treated like the blacks and the indigenous people to a degree. Because most of the time they were not allowed to leave the house. They couldn't date, couldn't marry, couldn't be social. They had to stay on the property, do what they were told to do, and not complain, basically. Were they taken advantage of? I got a feeling it's not public information, but my instinct tells me it was taken advantage. I'm sure there were people who took advantage of women, took advantage of whatever, okay? They mistreated them. But again, could they complain? Who would they complain to? They're not citizens. So they couldn't go to the local sheriff, so I don't know. I couldn't find a lot of material on that, but I have an instinct that probably was not the fairest way to treat people. I'm not sure what that guy in the front, is that guy looking at you? He's saying, can you believe this? I'm not sure what he's trying to tell us, but he's like, this is weird. And this is in New York, by the way. That wasn't New York, that was in New Amsterdam. Oh, let me tell you one more thing about Ona Washington. She was a good example of a colonial servant. So George Washington, who became our first president, had a slave named Ona Washington, a female. And she was a very good seamstress. She can knit clothing and do clothing altogether. So when the colony moved, when the capital of America moved from Philadelphia to New York, he brought her first to Philadelphia, then to New York. First the other way around, New York to Philadelphia. When they went to Philadelphia, she began looking around. She's saying, there's a lot of free black people in Philadelphia. They can go to shows, they can go to restaurants, they can walk in the street. They have freedom. She says, I can't do that. I have to do what my master tells me all the time. So she kind of figured that out for herself and ran away. She was a runaway. She got on a boat and went to New Hampshire. She managed to get a boat to New Hampshire. And once she was there in Portsmouth, Washington had a decision to make. Because was not his slave, was the white slave. Martha Custis had more money than he did, and most of her money was in slavery. So back then, if you had a slave escape, you had to pay the owner of the slave some amount of money to recompense, the lost slave. So he was like in a real quandary now. He's a president. If he comes on too strong, right, the northern people are going to be very upset, right? If he comes on too weak, southern people are not going to be too happy. So he had some people negotiate. He sent delegates out to talk to her, and they found her and talked to her and said, please come back, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. She didn't want to go back. She said, I absolutely will not go back. And she eventually just went towards Canada. She eventually just escaped altogether. It never came back. She said, I want my freedom. It's more important to me than anything else. But it gives you an idea of why indentured, even any kind of service really were not happy with their lot in life, with their situation. I talked to you about the Brown brothers, John and Moses Brown. They had sponsored this ship called the Sally. The Sally was a great big slave ship that brought candidates over to America. But can you see how they treated the slaves coming over? They were all on the bottom of the boat, chained together. God forbid someone became ill. What do you think happened if the guy next to your left or right died? Right? There's no medicine, there's no doctors, there's no treatment. So if someone became violently ill or something, you were just out of luck. They could never go up above board. Most of the time, they just had to stay in their confined area, chained up usually, given minimal amount of food. I'd say, as a rule, probably 30 to 40% of the slaves died on board. It was not atypical at all to have that kind of mortality rate in bringing them over. It was after this happened, this particular boat, the Sally, Very few people made it. There's supposed to be close to 200 people who were slaves going to be brought over. Less than 190 something, 92 or something, were actually made it over. What happened to the other 100? They either died or killed or committed. Some committed suicide. Some said, "I don't want to be slaves. I'd rather jump off the boat or do whatever." They killed themselves, or had someone kill them. They didn't want to be slaves. That's when only after that. It was only a few years after that. It was only 1770 that the Quakers said, "Now we're going to condemn slavery." So they kind of woke the Quakers up, and they were anti-slavery very strongly. Now they definitively. That became a turning point for them after this boat trip. So let's talk about our legal system now. So I began looking at some legal, what we had in Bay Colony for slavery. One of the first laws we had was called the Act of Liberty, 1641. And if you see a picture of a slave, an indigenous person right there, and you see he has a banner around his head, you see the little banner kind of floating kind of in the air there? It says, "Come over and help us." So the mindset was, oh, they're indigenous people? They need help. We got to help them. We got to come over and help them, which I don't think is right. I don't think the people in Ukraine have a flag that say, "Come over and help us." And I think they're fine. They were doing great by themselves. They didn't need to be helped. But that was the mindset. People said, "No, it's okay. We're doing them a favor by giving them a job or whatever. We're doing something positive for them." So this law goes on to say we don't want slavery, but then if you look at the very bottom line, it says, unless it should be judged differently by the authority. So it wasn't very clear. So if a local judge, a local delegate, mayor, whatever, somebody said, "Yeah, it's okay to keep him because he has these conditions, it's okay to keep him." So even though it was an anti-slavery act, it was kind of vague, very vague, I would say. It wasn't very clearly marked at all. Another amendment to the same act later, a couple of years later, we allow among us no inhumane, no barbarous, or no slave, so it's kind of an anti-slave act. So you can be whipped 25 times for one action. So if you take a loaf of bread, you do whatever, you kind of break curfew, whatever the act is that you do, you could be whipped 25 times for one act. Now, beyond that, it said unless an act is really shameful, then you could do even more. So even though it was kind of an anti-slavery thing, it didn't seem very humane to me. It didn't seem like this was the way we should be treating other human beings. Now, when did we change? 1783 is when we changed. We had a court, a Massachusetts federal court, and a state court, which had a judge by the name of William Cushing. Cushing was definitely anti-slavery. The first case, a couple years before this, there was a woman named Mum Bet. She lived up near the Pittsfield, Springfield, or somewhere there in the western part of the state. And she was there one night when the owner had a big frying pan and was going to knock the heck out of her sister. She was going to just whack her and hurt her and so on. So Mum Bet intervened, knocked the slave owner over, and they wound up in court. But she was protecting the life and the well-being of her sister. So this judge, the same judge, said, "It's not right. You have a right to protect yourself. You can't just do that arbitrarily." So that was one case. And then a couple years after that, there was another guy named Quag Walker. And Quag lived up in the Barry area. He was a runaway slave. And the reason he was a runaway is because the owner would beat him regularly. Every night, he would just beat the heck out of this guy, sometimes for no reason. So he went in front of the judge, and the same judge said, "It's not right. I mean, the more I think about it, all these cases are coming before me now. There are 3 cases in a row. He was the third one. So we have to just say slavery is invalid. You can't do slavery." Now, did that end slavery? No. It was a law, but someone has to enforce the law. So sometimes they looked away. What some people did in Massachusetts, not all, but some, took an indentured servant contract and just rewrote it. So it said, "Yeah, you were my slave before. Now I free you, but I want you to work in my home for 10 years or whatever it might be." They kind of made an agreement. That's what some people did. Some just didn't even tell them. Some just kept them as slaves and said nothing. So it really depended on the family and how they treated it. But slavery definitely continued right through to the Civil War, actually, in Massachusetts. Maritime, I'm going to go into different things that sea captains did. Sea captains, they were all across the board. Most of them are from Cape Cod. Most of the captains I'm talking about right here are from Cape Cod. So learn a little bit more about them. By the way, you see a picture of a whaling ship. One thing which is I didn't realize, 80% of the men who worked on whaling ships from, let's say, 1650 to 1750 were indigenous people. And the reason that was, the crew, basically the hard work, the labor, the really difficult part, was because mom or dad lived in Mashpee or wherever they lived, and they bought a blanket or food or something. They bought some kind of product, and the storekeeper would keep a log. Okay, now you owe me X amount of dollars. So you have a choice. You pay me like next week or a very short time period, or I will indenture your son, who's 21, to be working on a whaling ship. So I was reading about this. There's 3 books in a row I read about people who looked at the whaling population in 1730 to 40. Most of the ship, 50% or more, were indigenous people. They were just kind of forced to work and give them very little money, if at all. So that's just the way they did whaling back in the day. One of the biggest slave traders, this guy called the king of the slavers, Francis Bowen, he's an English fellow. He came over from England, and he delivered a lot of slaves. One time he had 200 slaves, 2,000 slaves, or 2,000 slaves on his boat, and he was caught. And that back then, obviously, it's illegal to bring slaves to Massachusetts. It was illegal. So he got caught, and he was going to be put to trial, and magically, he just vanished. So the judges and everyone said, "What happened? How come there's no trial?" Well, there's the judge, the jailers and so on, the prison guards are saying, "Geez, we don't know what happened. I don't know, just managed to survive somehow." So I'm pretty sure that there was a payment somewhere. Somebody got paid off, and they allowed this guy to escape. And he did it twice. Second time, we had a fellow by the name of Matthew Perry, not the actor, but the slave. He was acting an agent for us, kind of like the Coast Guard. His duty was to stop slave trading from Africa, and that was what he was supposed to do. And when he went over to do it, all the men on the ship, his underlings, his first and second and third mate, all came from the South. So they always said, let's look at this technically. Let's look at the letter of the law. Let's look. They always try to find ways. Every time he tried to arrest somebody, he couldn't do it. The Southerners would be on the boat and just prevented him from making an arrest. But he got caught 3 times, was never prosecuted. All right, so this I mentioned before. Some of the slave traders definitely were something that was, they could make money. So, for example, there's 3 examples here. Prince Crowell, the guy I mentioned, that little box that he had. He did a lot of cotton. He'd bring that to the mills. Isaac Clark of Brewster, he gave fish and different things to the people. So there was always a way to make money, either directly or indirectly. So most sea captains didn't want to end slavery immediately. They wanted it to continue on for a while. This guy is one of my heroes. If you ever drive in Hyannis, I'm sure you have, and you see Burst's Way, Burst Street. Okay. Well, Austin Burst began as a slave trader and did it for 10 years. If you really want to read a book detailing slave trade, you can make an appointment with the Sturgis Library. And let me just say that there's 2 places if you really want history, any kind of history, Mass Bay, 2 libraries I strongly recommend. Cape Cod Community College on the bottom level has what they call the Wilkins Library. If you email them and tell them what you want to study, they'll find books for you, find material, they'll work with you. Same thing for Sturgis. But they have a book there that this Beer fellow wrote, called His Life as a Slave Trader, reminiscences of his slave trade. And eventually he said, "I shall trade no more below the Mason-Dixon line." He just said, "I can't do it." Just his job, when the slave ship came into harbor, he had to separate the family. So mom would come here, dad would go there, kids would go there. He separated the whole family. And then finally the wailing and the gnashing of teeth and the sheer brutality that got to him, he said, "I can't do this job anymore." He became an avid anti-slave person. So I got a couple of slides about him first. He did some really good things, I would think. All right, so here's a picture of Robespierre. And the reason I have Robespierre pictures in there were 3 captains on board a ship that left from Brewster called the 10 Brothers. So there is conjecture that these 3 captains, Elijah Cobb was the owner of the boat. He wasn't on the boat, but had 3 of his friends doing the boat, went to France. And this boat was captured originally Cobb's boat was captured, and they went to France to, he said, "You can't take my boat." So he went to Paris to see if he could get the money back. And Robespierre happened to be the man in charge at the time. So he got a commitment from Robespierre to get the money back, but that was right in the middle of the French Revolution. So he saw the guillotine. He saw the guy he made the agreement with. He saw his head literally chopped off. So kind of brutal, but again, unfortunately, those things happen. Now, sea captains of color. This was a great thing, especially whaling. Whaling was definitely a meritorious system. If you knew something about caulking, fishing, whaling, boating, carpentry, anything of that nature that would be good for a whaler, you could move up the ladder. So a lot of whalers would hang out in the port cities. They would go to Georgia and Florida and all the ports and say, well, let me just stay here for a while. They would learn a trade, tying knots or being a caulker. The bottom of the boat would be, you take tar and whale blubber and you mix it together. It makes the boat very sturdy. So they began learning these trades. And the reason they did that because now they had some skill they could use. If they can get to the north, they could become a whaler. And once they're on the whaling ship, you become safe. If they spent 2-3 years sometimes out at sea, you were kind of protected. So that was not an unusual thing to do. This particular guy, Absalom Boston, came from Nantucket. And he was an Ashanti Indian, okay, one of those people too. His wife was indigenous, his father was black, Absalom Boston. And he kind of realized how much money could be made. He was the first captain to have an all-black crew, all black men, and they went up and down the South Coast, went to Texas, went to Alabama. Must be kind of unusual. People couldn't believe all of a sudden a black slave ship coming in with all black men. Must have been a real shock to some of the local people on shore. But he made pretty well for himself. He had a daughter too. He wanted to enroll into the Nantucket public schools, and back then a black student could not go to a public school. So he began a suit that said, filed a suit. He wasn't the only one. A couple of other people too. But eventually they changed their mind, and Boston did allow integration. So eventually it did happen. But he was one of the first ones to fight against that. He had an uncle, by the way, Prince Boston. I won't tell you that case, but it's a long case. But his uncle fought at that time, if you were a whaler, you couldn't keep your money. You had to give your money to the master. But he had a very complicated agreement. When the owner died, he'd be free and so on. He died before the guy actually got to court. But he went to court to get his money back, and he did. Eventually, his uncle was one of the first whalers to be paid as a slave. He finally managed to get some money out of it. Another black slave. This is a guy, Paul Coffey. This guy's an amazing guy, too. This guy is out of Cuttyhunk, which is, Martha's Vineyard area. He was born there, but he went to Westport, New Bedford area, New Bedford, New Westport. He had a lot of relatives. He had probably 11 cousins and brother-in-laws and all kinds of relatively big family. They were one of the biggest whaling groups in New England, by far. And he was black, and most of the whaling ships at that time his ships were particularly all black men. Eventually, between 1820 to 1840, people got a little bit anxious about black slavery. Some of the people were anti-slavery. So let's end this, okay? So they thought, well, one way to do it, we'll take everyone who doesn't belong here, and we'll ship them out of the country. I won't say a political statement now. I could, but I won't. We'll just get them out of here. Just get everyone out. And what they were going to move them to was Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone, he was going to be the president of this group. And that's what he would do. And he thought about it. He wanted to do this. But one of the things about him, near the end of his career, he began thinking, saying, is this right? Is it moral? Is it economical? Does it make sense? They didn't do it because they wanted to free the black people. They did it because they didn't want the blacks and whites to be together. They figured if they just pushed them to Africa, back to Africa, the problem would go away. So Madison, Monroe, Andrew Clay, a lot of people really thought about this as being a way to solve America's problem, African colonization. And then what he did near the end, saying, well, let me talk to people. He talked to whalers. He talked to local economists. He talked to merchants. He talked to citizens, North and South. And the more he did the research, he said, it's not going to work. It's too expensive. It's not practical. It's not going to solve problems. This can't be done. Way too many people. It costs a fortune to do all of this, so it doesn't make sense. Again, he changed it. If you go to the Massachusetts Maritime Academy, there's a whole wing of books and materials on Coffey. I wish I had time. I'd love to do a book on him. He's like a very interesting man. Made a lot of money. And then we got some captains who were unscrupulous. Here's an example. A guy, Jack Hannum, What he would do, he would take money from the slave trader, from the slave. I want to be a runaway, can you take me from your boat to wherever they were from to the north? And they were allowed to do it. So he would collect money from a slave, or an agreement, some kind of equal value. And then once the boat landed, he would contact somehow the local police who took the slave away, and then he made money by collecting a bounty on the slave. So that's not very nice. But he did that a couple of times. This picture you see here is William Lloyd Garrison had a newspaper called The Liberator, and that sparked American thought. So wait a minute, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this? And once he began publishing stories like that, how they treated the slaves, that kind of started some second thoughts. People began to change the way they do things. In 1840, we had the largest anti-slavery convention in America in Harwich, with over 2,000 people attended. And we had people like William Lloyd Garrison, we had Lucy Stone, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Phillips, Andrew, a lot of famous people who were anti-slavery wanted to, and this was prompted by a guy from Harwich who took a slave and did exactly what this guy did. He took the money and then tried to collect the money again. They said, that's horrendous, that's unconscionable. We shouldn't allow this kind of behavior to go on. So what happened in 1840, the sea captains, pretty much the sea captains, physically drove those people out of town. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want freedom of speech. They wanted to just push them away. And they did. They literally chased these poor abolitionists out of Harwich. They did it again in 1860, and now it was a little different. In 1860, they weren't pushed out as much. People began saying, there has to be an end to slavery. You can't say tomorrow. You can't say possibly down the road. Either we end it or we don't. We're not going to have a country. And that's basically, they were correct. I think we wouldn't have a country if we didn't take a nice firm action on it. All right, and now we got some captain, this guy from Harwich, Jonathan Walker. He freed some slaves. He knew about the slaves who needed to be escaped. And for example, one time in Florida, he found there were 15 slaves on an island. He took his boat down to Florida, was going to rescue them, bring them up to the north, but he was caught along the way. The authorities caught him. And they put him in they went to jail in Florida, and they kept him for almost a year. They didn't have a trial for a year, no trial, but eventually they had a meeting, so to speak, and they took his hand, and they took a branding iron, and they put the letter SS into his hand. As far as I know, there could be other ones, but he was the only American citizen who had a branding put to his physical being. And that's what he did. He was always known as a slave saver. Another guy, Daniel Drayton from New Bedford, he had one time 77 slaves. That was a big saving rescue. But they apprehended him in time too. It never happened. It didn't go too well. Two more examples of unusual things for slave captains. We had a guy named Jonathan Bourne. The town of Bourne is named after this guy, by the way. Made a lot of money, had 17 whaling ships, made lots and lots of money. He became, in 1860, the director of the Republican Party. So they were debating whether or not, should it be William Stewart or should it be Lincoln? Who's going to be our next presidential candidate? Luckily, we had Jonathan Bourne there, because the majority of people going in, they felt for sure that William Stewart, Stewart's Folly, the guy, the Alaska thing, they figured he was going to get the nomination. This guy kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and eventually Lincoln was nominated. So I always wondered what would have happened to our country if Lincoln was not our president. You never, again, conjecture. You never know whether it might have been better, might have been worse. You really don't know either way, but certainly monumental. Then there was another guy, this guy, Squire Doane from Yarmouth. He was the leader of the temperance movement, but he had the biggest bar in town. I don't know how that happened, but he did. He was also a contact for the Fugitive Slave Act, but once they gave him the slaves, he sold them. So I don't get that. And then he was like a pro-American guy all the way, but he said, could you pay me in Spanish money? Because back then, the banks gave more money, like a profit margin was greater if you used Spanish money. So he was kind of a quirky guy, but he knew how to make money, though. All right, so going back to the Vigilance Committee. Boston, 1820s and 30s, we had a committee, finally, this guy, Austin Burst, I told you about. We had Richard Dana, 2 years before the mass, that guy. We had Harriet Beecher Stowe. We had Phillips. Right in Wiano. A lot of these guys, by the way, 3 or 4 of them lived right in Wiano. So I'm not sure that was a hotbed of anti-slavery movement, but was here for sure. The sailboat that you see in the picture is called the Moby Dick. So what he would do, I told you Austin Bierce became the port director for Boston. After he did the slavery thing, he went to Boston and became their slave harbor master. So he knew who was coming in, who was leaving, why they were coming, and so on. So he kind of made an agreement. If they were sympathetic for slavery, anti-slavery, he would meet them like way out before they actually got to harbor, take a small boat, get the slaves on this rowboat, and then bring them to shore. So he was able to save quite a few slaves by doing that. So Bierce was a kind of a political activist of his time, so it was kind of very helpful to the people. By the way, Harriet Beecher Stowe got her book. One of the reasons she talked for a long time with Bierce said, "Tell me what plantation was like." She was never seen a plantation. So when she wrote the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, she got a lot of information just by talking to this guy Bierce, just to see what that was all about. And he talked about the convention, we kind of skipped that. It's really, really a horrible thing when you think about it. We're getting near the time. Okay, I only have two more. A couple of notable slaves from Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass lives in New Bedford. Great speaker. He became very popular. We have Crispus Attucks, our very first black slave, the first guy killed in the pre-Revolutionary War. A couple of years before the Revolution, we had the Boston Massacre. So what happened there was a young boy was hurt, and the American colonists didn't like the fact that the boy was hurt the day before. So en masse, they came out as a military group into the thing, and they were shot by the British. So he was the one who took a rock and a stone and threw it at the British guy. He got shot. So he was the first American killed, and that preempted our thought about that. Phyllis Wheatley, great writer. She came on the boat to Phyllis and was adopted by the Wheatley people. But she knew Greek and Latin, tutored by the children of the Wheatley family, and wrote some books. The Queen loved her work, and even Lincoln loved her work. Unfortunately, she died in poverty. Her husband, she finally married a guy who turned out to be a real bum, left her alone, ran away, and she had no money. She ended up very poor, dying all by herself in Boston. Sojourner Truth lived in Massachusetts for a while. She was a pacifist and an anti-slave person, and women's rights. She covered all the bases. She wanted everything to be more equitable among many people. Sergeant Gooding was a black American who fought in the Civil War. We had the 54th Massachusetts Regiment Civil War. If you've been in the Boston State House, right in front, there's a little statue. That's where that little statue is located. He wrote a letter to Lincoln and said, "Why are the black soldiers paid less than the white soldiers?" That's one thing. And why are the black soldiers given less benefits in terms of, even currently? They were segregated. So their housing was different and their food was different. Everything was different for the blacks versus the white. Lincoln never answered that letter. John Mashow, I won't talk about him. He's a pretty cool guy. You gotta buy the book. You gotta buy the book. I gotta give you interest anyway. So these two guys are in my book. You can read about them. The last guy, William Appice, is my last slide. He was a indigenous person, so half indigenous, half black. And he wrote a book about the Mashpee people, the Wampanoags, which is called The Native Son. And that began people thinking. They realized how much they shortchanged the indigenous people. So thank you very much for coming. I didn't see anybody sleeping. I didn't hear any snoring. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
So Donna Curtin of the Pilgrim Society in Plymouth,
Yeah.
in an unpublished paper about slavery and abolition in the Plymouth colony,
Right.
notes that in 1637, the, quote, blackamoor was counted among those who were trusted to bear arms for the militia. And it wasn't until 1637, according to Curtin, that there were slaves in the Plymouth colony. I don't see a distinction in what you've presented between the Puritan colony of Massachusetts Bay and the Plymouth colony, which of course merged in 1692.
Right.
I don't see a distinction there. And I do see a claim that as early as 1625 there were slaves in, obviously it had to be the Plymouth colony because Massachusetts Bay didn't begin until 1630.
Right.
So what's your evidence for slaves in Plymouth colony prior to 1637?
Well, the only thing I would say to that is I looked in every town. I tried to go to the judicial system. If you say, I gave Essex or Nathaniel to my daughter. I gave, take a name, any name, okay? I gave so-and-so to my son. I don't think you're going to have your son or daughter in your will. I mean, that's just a given. But chances, and again, I could be wrong, but I would say, yeah, I interpret it that way. So if I misinterpret it, it's possible. That's what history is all about. We have to study it a lot. I learn every time I come, by the way. I mentioned a guy named Broadway. I didn't go into his background. This guy raised his hand, similar to you. He said, my grandfather was Benjamin, not Bradley, but Broadway. But yet I found 5 books that all had the name Bradley. So do I believe him? Do I believe the books? I mean, I don't know. Sometimes these things are just not terribly clear, so it's a good point.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Any other thoughts, comments? Did no one's know him? Really?
Well, hi.
Hi.
You mentioned the Red Roof Church in Brewster.
Right.
And people left because of they were more anti-slavery.
Right.
For Harwich.
Uh-huh.
Is that the first church of Brewster or another?
No, it's a different church. It was a much smaller church. I live right near that church, but I live in Brewster. Yeah, there was a priest or a pastor for the Red Roof Church, and he kept talking about freeing slaves, but he never got around to doing anything. And his wife actually began having slaves. So finally, half that parish has left him. I think they went to the Congregational Church. He did have other groups, but they left that church. So, yeah, that was a point of contention.
And on that point, the first Congregational Church in Harwich was the first church in Harwich to ban anyone from membership unless they were abolitionists.
Oh.
And that was 1640s.
I didn't know that. Thank you. Good to know. Good to know.
Well, I'm sure Mr. Pregot will answer more questions. He's going to have his books for sale in the back of the room here. If you'd like to talk to him some more. Thank you all for coming.
Again, there are 2 books if you want. One book is Sea Captain of the Cape Cod. If you haven't seen that, I have a couple of those. But the slave book is there too. So thank you again for coming. I appreciate it.